Hello, today we are going to be talking about community ecology. So remember, what is a community? And it is the relationships that we see between different populations, different groups of the same organism. So in this picture here, we have giraffes, we have um, some different types of some zebras, some birds of some sort, some other types of herding animals. And how do these species interact with each other? Uh, Really, if you look at the picture closer, um, and I mean significantly closer than you can actually by zooming, but like just really think about it, there's a bunch of other species in the picture that we aren't even considering. Like I just named all the animals, but what about the plants? I mean, obviously there are populations, they're interacting, they are very significant and important to these animals. Um, the microbes, the bacteria and such that are in the water, on the animals, in their guts. Again, those all go into impacting this whole ecosystem. Some animals not pictured, but obviously very important and that are part of the community are some of the predators. Like for example, lions might be somewhere hiding not too far away. A lot of times in Africa, water holes are really dangerous for some of these animals because, I mean, they all need water, and predators know this, and so they kind of it's a great place to set up an ambush. Okay, so um, we talked about this previously, but basically, when you have a positive relationship and a negative relationship together, so one species has positive, one has negative, that can be predation. It can also be parasitism. Um, just depends on the level of killing and eating versus slowly sapping the nutrients away. Um, if one gains a positive but the other one is neutral, we call that commensalism. If both gain a benefit, that's mutualism. Amensalism is basically neither species really cares, neither gains a benefit. They are in a relationship because they're near each other, but uh, that's amensalism. Um, I, sorry, one gets negative and one is neutral. So the one doesn't care that it's there, but it is harming the other one. Neutralism is where they're both neutral. Sorry. Um, and then competition is both species have a drawback of sorts, and so we'll go ahead and go over those in the next couple of pages. So an ecological niche is think of a niche as kind of like the job of the organism. What's its role within the ecosystem? Now, it's even more specific than that. A lot of times we think, all right, well, they're a predator. Well, there's a lot of different predators. Are the predators eating big prey? Are they eating small prey? And that falls underneath this food consumption. Um, are they hunting things, on the ground or up in the trees? That's space utilization. The same prey might live part of its life cycle or part of its day down on the ground and some of the day up in the tree. Um, so where is it being attacked by the predator? Um, for example, mice can be caught by a coyote. Again, that's when it's coming down onto the ground, and that's the strategy that particular animal is using to catch it. Whereas uh, birds might fly down, such as like a hawk or something, and grab hold of the mice. Again, that's kind of the space utilization. If that mouse is a specific species of mouse that goes up and down the tree and forages on the forest floor, but maybe lives up in the tree, or maybe even think of a squirrel. That might be even a better example. Um, where is it being hunted at? That's space utilization. Um, and notice that animal is using a specific type of strategy where it lives up in a tree and goes down to the forest floor to get more food. Why isn't it getting its food in a tree that it lives in? Well, there might be something else eating food in that area. So you can see all these different organisms are trying to fit into these different niches. And this is all to avoid competition because if they're both eating the same food or taking up the same space, something's got to give. Who does a better job at it? Because in nature, and this is what drives evolution, there's going to be limited resources. Temperature range. Some animals prefer it colder, some prefer it warmer, some moderate temperature. Um, it has to do with what their specific role is, what their niche is, and that again is a way of avoiding competition. Like for example, polar bears and grizzly bears really live in different climates. Yes, grizzly bears do live very, very far up north, but they don't live where it's pretty much so snowy year round or the tundra. Polar bears do. Now, because of environmental change and the reduction in basically the ice shelf at the North Pole, those polar bears are having less and less places to live, and so they're basically being pushed out of their normal ecosystem. They prefer it to be snowy and to hunt seals, but now they're starting to compete more and more with grizzly bears. Actually, we're even starting to see some hybridization of polar bears and grizzly bears. Grizzly bear populations are going down because their best niche is to be in that Arctic situation, but it's being reduced, and so now they're being forced to compete with the grizzly bears, and the grizzly bears are more designed for that subarctic climate, and so they're basically out competing the polar bears and doing a better job at it. So that's temperature range. Appropriate conditions for mating. Again, some organisms that are closely related, they regulate their mating cycles differently to avoid competition. Or another thing that really is competition is even within their own species. Like, for example, with deer, usually only one male, maybe a couple males per herd are actually going to mate. Most of the other males either get kicked out or just never do get to mate. And that's again because of competition, but that's within their species. That's not between two communities. But you can also see that like within populations where one herd kind of overtakes another herd because of a very dominant male. Requirements for moisture. Typically, we think of this as being plants, but even animals. There are some animals that follow the rain patterns and they migrate according to the rains in Africa. The time that it occurs there, when is it living there? So in Costa Rica, we have two major species of sloth. We have two-toed and three-toed sloths, and those are two animals that are basically have the same type of lifestyle. They pretty much so just hang out in trees, move really slowly to avoid being detected by predators, don't come out of the trees really that often, and they tend to focus on an area around a tree. And how do they avoid competition? Because really they're doing the same thing. Well, one of them is diurnal and one of them is nocturnal. Diurnal means they're active during the day, and nocturnal means they're more active at night. So these two different species of sloth avoid competition by one being active more during the day, one being more active at night. So we can also divide niche down even further into two other major categories. We have what we call their fundamental niche. The niche a space and organism can, that's the important word there, can fill in the absence of competition or predation. Whereas the realized niche is, where is it actually living? So to better understand this, on this next slide, what we see is here we have these larger barnacles, and they only live underwater. They cannot live out of water. Whereas these smaller barnacles can live either in water or out of water. So the tide comes up, they're fine. The tide goes down, they're still fine. These big barnacles, though, cannot live below the tide line. And so these guys probably are actually better at obtaining food and using their space. They're bigger. And so that's great for them. And they probably are better at what they do than these smaller barnacles. The thing is that they can only live underwater. So we end up with the two different species not competing against each other. Now, let's say we introduce a new fish to the area that's not native. And this fish likes barnacles. And it's going to go after the bigger ones because bigger ones are easier to spot, they're tastier, they provide more nutrients. Well, it's keeping this population very, very low, and so therefore this introduced species of fish is only eating these big barnacles. Their population goes down, and basically what we end up with is now one species of barnacle that's much smaller. And this is how introduced species can upset the balance of competition within an ecosystem and the biological diversity. After we introduce that fish that is picking on these bigger barnacles, notice we have no diversity at all in that ecosystem. And just remember that biodiversity is vitally important to ecosystems because it allows them to adapt and deal with problems. If this is something that's naturally occurring, that's different. But when we have it as man-made issues, then um, it tends to cause problems in sense that if there was something natural that was causing a reduction in this population, like a disease or something, the stronger barnacles might come back and retake their niche. When we've introduced a species that just eats them, we might wipe out the species altogether. All right. So we talked about like mating competition, and that's what sexual selection is. We talked about this during evolution, but sexual selection is when basically there doesn't seem to be any good reason to have the trait in terms of surviving. But the reason you have the trait is to basically have a better chance of passing on your genes. Basically, the peacock with the biggest, brightest, and prettiest feathers is going to woo the peahen most likely. Um, the bright chest here on this lizard. There's no reason to have that. I mean, that's going to draw in predators, but the female lizards might make them notice him more, and so therefore be more likely to mate. Same thing with some of these other coloration patterns that we see. Um, Sometimes you have competition within a population, and like with wolves, they have like this hierarchy where they have alpha uh, dogs, alpha males, and then you have your betas, and I believe they're deltas and epsilons, where they're basically this hierarchy where the alphas eat first. They're the ones that mate and pass on our genes. The betas may eventually become an alpha, but basically they get second pick of the meat. And when you get to like your deltas and epsilons, they have very little chances at getting food. They're weaker. They're on the outsides, um, of that particular pack. So when competition occurs, we see one of two things that happen. Either we have competitive exclusion or coexistence. Let's talk about coexistence first. Um, Fundamental niches of two species overlap, but the realized niche does not. So, like back with those barnacles, the two species could coexist because they didn't outcompete each other. They just had to find different roles. All right. It can lead to resource partitioning. Like, for example, in those barnacles, one was where the tide went up and down. The other one could only be where water covered them all the time. And so they both pretty much did the same thing. They just did it in different parts of the water. Okay, so that's coexistence. They find a way to coexist. Competitive exclusion, no two species with the same niche can coexist when resources are limiting. And resources are always limited, and it varies. Like sometimes two animals can do the same job because there's plenty of resources, but if there's any change in the environment and those resources start to get reduced, now the two animals are going to be fighting for existence. And basically, the one that does it better is going to eliminate the other. The other species is going to go extinct, at least in that area, because they can't do the niche as well as the other. We see this a lot in, like, for example, Australia, where they've introduced mammals that are placentals. They're better at reproducing, and we see with marsupials, like for example, the ones that live in Australia, that a lot of them fill the same niches that we see in the rest of the world, but they're marsupials because Australia was separated, had their own basically continent, and had their own space, and so the marsupials filled all these niches. They went through adaptive radiation and filled all these different niches and did their own thing. Um, but we started introducing some mammals, and it starts to push, or some of the placental mammals, and they pushed out all of these marsupials. And so a lot of marsupials have been devastated in Australia just because of introduction of things like, for example, wolves and rabbits. Um, they do the jobs that the other animals do. They just do it more efficiently and can really, the big one is that they reproduce faster and more efficiently. Um, and so because they're doing the same role, the introduced species is um, basically devastating the marsupials. So here are some different type of symbioses, and that is grammatically correct here. But here we're talking about positive, negative ones, like, for example, predation, even herbivory, so carnivorous and herbivorous. They're eating other organisms. We don't think of koalas as being negative to something, but really they're eating the leaves, which reduces the amount of ability for the plant to photosynthesize. Here we have a parasitic wasp. It lays eggs on a living host. It's this type of spider, and then it infects the spider and kills it by parasitizing it. The larvae parasitize it. The same thing can be said of, like, for example, viruses and other diseases. So there's ectoparasitism, where the organism's feeding on the outside. So these are some lampreys. And here's an example of an endoparasite. It's kind of an interesting one. So what happens here is there's this flatworm, and it infects the ants, and then it takes control of the ants and makes the ants want to stand up on top of the blades of grass. And so a deer comes along and eats the grass and inadvertently ingests the ant, thereby ingesting the flatworm, and now that flatworm in its adult stage infects the deer and lays its eggs inside the deer that then, when it defecates, its poop will be carrying the eggs, and ants will find that and then continue the cycle. Predation drives natural selection. Obviously, we talked about, like, how dark colored mice versus light colored mice on the same ground. The lighter colored mice are going to be easier to be seen. So this is, it impacts the competition. Predator-prey systems, it's a coevolutionary arms race. When one adapts, the other one has to make a new adaptation, or they're going to become extinct. So it's always this constant battle where one is making an adaptation, the other one's making a counter adaptation. So, for example, these trees really don't want to be digested by other animals. So they do things like produce these thorns. This tree right here has little spikes all along the outside. This one has little thorns sticking out. Again, makes it less desirable for a herbivore to eat. Here's another example. So oak trees have an advantage over maple leaves. Basically, all plants have cellulose that make up their cell walls. Lignin is what makes wood, and oak leaves are hardier than maple leaves. They're a little bit more brittle, but they're also stronger, and that's because they put this lignin in there, which is harder to digest, so fewer species of insect can eat that. Here we have a tomato hornworm, also a tobacco hornworm. Now, both tomato and tobacco plants, they are related, but this hornworm tends to really eat only tomato plants because the nicotine is basically a chemical defense that the tobacco plant produces and is deadly to these worms in large quantities. And so it limits their population, and basically gives an extra defense. All right, so here's another type of chemical defense. This plant releases this chemical into the air. Now, this is going to be a symbiotic relationship that's mutualistic in a second. So this chemical gets released, right? And then what's going to happen is it draws in this wasp, and this wasp comes and stings and paralyzes this worm. And then the wasp is then going to lay some eggs on the worm. And the eggs feed on the caterpillar and basically kill it. And then even though the caterpillar is dead, now these worms pupate on top of the dead caterpillar. So what is the benefit to the plant and what's the benefit to the wasp? The wasp is signaled and told where there's a place to lay its eggs and food for its offspring, helping it reproduce, and the plant gets things to stop eating it. A lot of different types of organisms are also poisonous. Poisonous is different than venomous. We call some snakes poisonous, but understand that they're venomous. Venom is when you bite something, you inject it. Whereas poisonous is you release a toxin that makes you basically not tasty or even deadly. A lot of toads have a parotid gland, which excretes a toxin. So interestingly enough, the poison dart frogs, the way they get their toxins is they eat insects, which themselves are producing toxins. So why are the insects producing toxins? Well, to keep them from being digested by toads or frogs. Well, some of the frogs have developed the ability to digest those compounds and then turn those compounds into their toxins. So the frogs that we see, the poison dart frogs we see in the Cleveland Zoo, they're not that toxic, if toxic at all, because they aren't eating insects that are producing toxins. And by the way, where did the insects get their toxins? Well, remember the toxins we talked about in the plants. So the insect eats the toxins in the plant is producing to keep it from being attacked by the insects. The insects then convert those toxins into their own toxins to keep them from being attacked by the frogs, and now the frogs are now producing toxins to keep other things from eating them. And this is an example of biomagnification of these toxins just moving up the food chain and getting more potent as you move up the food chain. Because remember, this frog is going to eat hundreds of insects in its lifetime, thousands. And those insects are going to eat thousands of plants in their lifetime. So it builds up as it goes up the food chain. But most animals, if they tried eating like even those insects that are toxic, they would get sick and die or just have like some major digestive distress and just avoid eating them any further. I skipped a couple pages there. Okay, so we have mimicry and we have two major types. Batesian mimicry, which is a palatable or non-toxic organism, resembles another kind of organism that is toxic. So one of them is toxic, and another one looks like it just enough so that it gets the benefit of the other one being toxic. And so, like, for example, if we have a butterfly that's toxic, like, for example, monarchs, they eat milkweed. Milkweed has a bitter alkali compound. By the way, bitter in nature tends to point towards alkali, which tends to be a poison. And it makes when the larvae are eating that, when they pupate and turn into a butterfly, their wings are extremely bitter, and birds hate that taste. And so there are what are called viceroys, and they look a lot like the monarchs, and birds can't tell the difference. Honestly, I really can't tell the difference unless I have like a field guide with me trying to figure it out. So the viceroy gets the benefit of the monarch being toxic just by looking like it. Now, Mullerian is two or more unrelated species, but they look similar. Both are toxic, and they both kind of reinforce their ideas. So basically, it makes them, the predators, learn faster that, hey, this is something I want to avoid. So here's an example of Batesian mimicry. Again, this butterfly right here, very toxic. This one, not toxic, but looks similar enough that birds can't tell the difference. Which of these are bees? If you saw one of these flying around in the room, you'd probably kind of flip out because you're like, oh, I don't want to get stung, bees. Well, none of those are bees. They all just look like bees. They have similar bodies. They look more than similar enough, but none of them sting. They just happen to look like bees. And so again, that is an example of Batesian mimicry. Now, here's Mullerian, where both of these species here and both of these down here are toxic. All right, so physical defenses, morphological adaptations, things that basically help defend these guys, like, for example, porcupine quills, again, help the porcupines because nothing wants to get poked with those. As a matter of fact, the unique thing about porcupine quills is they're kind of like a fishing hook, except for they run the whole length. The little barbs at the end of a fishing hook, they're made so that they go in and don't come out. Well, imagine the whole length of the fishing hook having those little barbs. That's really what these quills are. And so the quills can only work into the skin, they can't really work out. And so that's why a lot of things just basically try to avoid porcupines. The snake has a rattle. Again, you, it's one of those sounds that if you hear it, you know what it means immediately. You leave it alone, right? Last thing you want to do is to be bit by a rattlesnake. Bees. This is why people freak out about those bee mimics, because it's just very unpleasant to be stung. Uh, Talking about unpleasant, skunks. They have just this terrible, terrible, awful smell that is hard to get off. And so a lot of animals try to avoid messing with a skunk, uh, unless you have a dog that's just really a sucker. I had a friend several years back, and he was over visiting, and the the dog we had came up to him and just loved Scott, and just came up to him, and Scott's petting him and petting him. And man, this dog really stinks. And it's like, yeah, that's why he's going to you for attention, because we haven't had anything to do with touching him for like the last week because he got sprayed with a skunk. Anyways, so yeah, no one wanted to touch our dog, Jake. We were avoiding him, and he was just dying for attention. And he found somebody that would give him attention because he smelled so awful. And he just had been sprayed with a skunk. It was like the second or third time in the last couple of months, and my dad was just tired of getting the stink off of him, so he just left him that last time. Was going to get to it eventually. All right, so camouflage. In camouflage again helps these organisms blend in with their environments, helps them have a better chance of survival and passing on their traits. Um, Again, it's a type of mimicry here where they're mimicking their surroundings. You can even have behavioral defenses, like for example, you have uh, the and by the way, some of these behavioral things can be uh, can evolve more than once. So, for example, here we have, um, I believe these are prairie dogs, but meerkats do the same thing where one of them kind of stands lookout and looks, and then if they see a hawk flying up above, they start screaming and start smacking their tail on the ground, and all the rest of them know to hide and avoid it. Here we have a behavioral defense where this mayfly flips its tail up to look like a scorpion. That doesn't have a sting at all, but this stonefly doesn't want anything to do with this mayfly because it thinks it's going to get stung like by, for example, a scorpion. If you think about most, and so this goes back to evolutionary arms race thing. So most herbivores do one of two things. They're either really, really big. There's a certain board game I play. It's actually called Evolution, and one of the rules of the game is that if you're a predator, you have to eat something smaller than you. You can't attack an herbivore that's bigger than you. And really, that's what happens in nature. I mean, really, any one of these lions is not going to take on that elephant. That elephant is gigantic. It's really strong. It's really powerful. You just would not mess with it. Now, what's the counter to that? And I was mentioning it's a board game. They do it. They have this skill where predators can team up and take down the larger prey. Basically, the size of the population of the predators can outscore the size of the prey. And really, that's where this pack hunting comes in, where you have a group of lions, they might be able to take down an elephant. What's another counter? Well, maybe the animals just are in a big herd. By having a really large herd of these animals, it's hard for the predator to pick on one of them. They're kind of working together to avoid the predators. So, predators had to have adaptations, claws, long teeth, fangs, and venoms. Um, and again, even things like intelligence and excellent vision, those are all things that go into making a predator better at hunting its prey. In mutualism, we have two organisms gain a benefit. And so this bullhorn acacia tree, what it does is it produces this nectar, and inside it we have little ants that come out and protect it. How are they protecting it? Well, in the rainforest, a lot of things grow on top of each other, and some things, like strangler figs, are a parasitic plant that wrap around trees and actually strangle them and take over their space. Well, that can't happen to the acacia tree because if anything starts to grow on this plant or anything comes up and tries to even eat it, then these ants come out and they start attacking and bite. What do the ants get in turn? Well, inside the tree, so first of all, they have little nectar pods. You can see the one that's right there. But also inside the tree, we have all of these little larvae and these ants there have a space to live. Um, Now, because the tree doesn't like things touching it, and so like the ants will come out, this bird has adapted away, and for whatever reason the insects don't attack it. It could be that the bird releases some scent or pheromone or something like that. But this bird can live in this tree and avoid being attacked by snakes. There's some other mutualistic relationships. Now you might say, well, this bat is eating the fruit. How is that helping the plant? Well, it's seed dispersal. Same thing with the monkey there. Here we have hummingbirds and bees pollinating the plants. Those animals get food in terms of the nectar, but then they increase the chances of reproduction for the plants. Last one here is commensalism. So really all these plants here, this is called Spanish moss. It's not a moss, but a type of plant that's growing on top of these other ones. And this is the lower parts of the plant where a lot of the sticks have died and such. A lot of times this swamp like floods up and such, and so all these sticks are dead down here, and they're just extra spaces that this plant called Spanish moss can grow on and get closer to sun. It's not harming the tree underneath it. It's just giving it a space to live. It doesn't harm the tree, so the tree doesn't care that it's there, and obviously this moss gets a benefit. Now again, it's not really a moss, it's just called Spanish moss. Um, but it has a place to grow and spread and photosynthesize.